That I don't feel that I'm being all that generous when I urge people to listen to my opponent in the primary, because I don't know whether I do better when I talk or she talks. I will say that I want to address clearly the issues in this campaign. I am not for impeaching President Obama. And spending probably $1 trillion to go to Mars when we're being told we haven't got the funding to do things domestically that are very important. I'm also opposed to that. And in fact, what President Obama has done is to show up some of the hypocrisy of some of my conservative friends who talk about, oh, they want to cut the deficit, because he is proposing a restraint on space spending. Let's be very clear. Talk to scientists, and they will tell you that space exploration by instrumentation is very important. And yes, we did go to the moon, and there was some limited role for human space travel. They fixed the Hubble telescope. But in general, spending vast amounts on human beings detracts from getting the best bang for the buck in terms of scientific research. And by the way, NASA is the National Atmospheric and Space Administration, and too little has been done about atmospheric research. So when I talk to scientists, they very much disagree with that proposal to go to Mars. Let me just say one last thing about the financial reform. I voted against the repeal of Glass-Steagall. That happened a while ago. We are implementing many of the policies that are represented with Paul Volcker, but the notion that that's the cure-all, let me be very clear to people, whether Glass-Steagall was in effect or not would have had no impact on AIG. Whether Glass-Steagall was in effect or not had no impact on Lehman Brothers. There are serious problems in the economy that post-date the whole Glass-Steagall situation, but we are going to be imposing some severe restraints on what banks can do under the leadership of Paul Volcker, and I'm very glad that we're going to be able to do that. So we are going to be passing this month the toughest set of restrictions on financial institutions since the New Deal. Another example, by the way, that has nothing to do with Glass-Steagall is we will be setting up, and I'm very proud of the work I've done with Elizabeth Warren from Harvard Law School, a fully independent consumer financial protection agency that will be protecting people from abuses in credit cards and overdrafts, and also, because frankly the banks have not been the major problem here, it's been the non-banks, the payday lenders, the check cashers. We're going to be covering them also fully. And one other very important piece, 30 years ago, when people borrowed money, they were generally borrowing it from a bank, a regulated entity, and they were going to pay that bank back. And that kept loans in a fairly good place. Since then, the economy has evolved, and a lot of money is being raised outside of banks, and it's being lent by people who, having made the loans, sell the right to be repaid, and don't have the interest in whether or not that was an original borrower. It's called securitization. We are putting a risk retention factor in there. You will no longer be allowed to lend money and then not worry about whether it's repaid. And one group of mortgage bankers came to us and complained and said, oh, but if you do that, we'll go out of business. I said, well, why? We're talking about 5 or 10%, although we'll be up front, so it's a significant restraint on them. But why would that put you out of business if you have to keep some of the money you lend out? They said, oh, because we don't have any money. So let me see if I understand this. You don't have any money. Your objection is that we are keeping you from lending money that you don't have, and the answer is, great, that's what we wanted to do. But in addition, we are clearly depriving ourselves of things that are important for the quality of our life. Obviously, taxation can be a burden, but there is a public sector reality that is being underdone. I've been doing this for a long time, as many people have been here. I have never seen a tax cut put out a fire. I've never seen a tax cut go to the aid of hungry children who needed some kind of succor. So we need to get a balance between the private and public sectors. Part of the problem is, and it's the one disagreement I have with the president currently, he announced a freeze on budgetary spending, but exempted military spending. That was a mistake. I want America to be strong. I want to protect our national security, and I want to make sure we have what we need to fight terrorism. But keeping the full panoply of weapons we built to destroy the Soviet Union in the thermonuclear war doesn't make me feel any safer. It makes me feel cooler, because we're not going to have that. And defending Western Europe so that the nations of Western Europe can hold their own military spending down also makes us poorer, not safer. Go back to the New York Times, go to your internet. 3 weeks ago, the front page of the Sunday Times, left-hand column, talking about the greater degree of welfare benefits that European societies have been able to provide to their citizens, although with the debt crisis they're going to have to cut back some. And they said Europe has been able to do this in part because Europe is sheltered by NATO and the American nuclear umbrella. In other words, England and France and Germany and Norway and Belgium and the Netherlands and other quite wealthy nations have military budgets half or less than ours as a percentage of GDP, because we're out there protecting them. We just caused the government of Japan to fall, a more progressive government than they've had historically, because we insisted, and again I think President Obama made this mistake, that they maintain 15,000 Marines on Okinawa. And nobody I've talked to tells me what the hell they are doing there. I don't want to see Taiwan overrun by the People's Republic of China. But we're not going to do that by lending 15,000 Marines to combat 1 billion Chinese in the military. We're going to do it if we have to with air power and sea power. We have substantially overcommitted militarily to things that don't relate to our own security, because we are the world power and we're defending everybody else. And in an effort to do bipartisanship, I have joined with Congressman Ron Paul from Texas, and he and I have just commissioned a report that says you can reduce military spending over the next 10 years by $1.111 billion beyond what is projected without any sacrifice of our national security. So it's going to be a challenge to the deficit horse to cut back. During the height of the Cold War, we were 26% of military spending in the world. We're now 41% of military spending in the world. Larry Korb, who worked under Reagan in the Defense Department, said we used to have 60% of the combined total of all the other military forces that could be arrayed against us. We now have 250% of that. And that, of course, means no more Iraqs. Even Karl Rove has acknowledged that if they knew there were no weapons of mass destruction, they wouldn't have been able to get into Iraq. Now, by the way, the reason they didn't know is they didn't want to know, because they wanted an excuse to invade. And Afghanistan is now, I read in yesterday's New York Times that Karzai now thinks that he can't win and he wants to make a deal. Let us not stand in his way. This notion that we insist on the right to spend tens of billions of dollars and destabilize societies over the objective of the people there is based on a very outdated concept of national security. So we are working on it. By the way, one other example of hypocrisy from my conservative friends. Many of them are the great defenders of agricultural subsidies, which are anti-consumer, anti-environment, anti-budget deficit. They were just found. We were just found to be in violation of our world trade obligations. Now, I was opposed to the WTO because I thought it didn't take into account working conditions and the environment. But it passed over my objection. We're members of the World Trade Organization. Brazil just won a suit at the WTO by their procedures in which it was found that Americans are subsidizing American cotton farmers to the disadvantage of Brazilian cotton farmers who are then being undersold in the world. The finding was that we are subsidizing our cotton farmers to the amount of $147 million a year. And that's putting the Brazilians at a disadvantage. So here's the solution. Again, the president was sort of forced into this by the farmers, the conservative farmers. Saxe Pete Chambliss, the man who ran that terrible campaign against Max Cleveland. He's the senior Republican on the Agriculture Committee from Georgia. He and I had an argument about agricultural subsidies. He said, we've got to protect food security in the United States. I said, Saxe Pete, how much cotton are you people eating down there? It ain't cotton candy. And here's what they have proposed, and that the president had to deal with this subsidy. Instead of rescinding our subsidy, we're going to subsidize Brazilian cotton farmers, $147 million a year. I've joined with one of the leading Republican critics of spending, Jeff Flake, to rescind that. So there are very real issues. We have got to find places to cut spending elsewhere so we don't sacrifice the quality of our life. Thank you.